Okay. My name is John Huppert. I'm an artist, and this video is about my most recent artwork. Right now we're in a warehouse, not a warehouse actually, it's an industrial site. It's an old building built in 1906, and it's been subdivided into various types of small businesses, and this is where my studio is located, just down the hallway here. There are lots of different industries here, primarily cabinet makers, woodworkers. My favorite is a coffee brewer. Guy does 18-pound batches of the most exotic coffees you can imagine, and they're all roasted absolutely perfectly. And there are a couple artists in the building, or at least in the complex. I don't know any of them. I've met one or two, but I really don't know any of them. But this is the warehouse. I mean, it's not a warehouse. You've heard of warehouse. It's just an old industrial site. Actually, it's really very off the beaten path. We're between two sections of railroad tracks. And it's one of the nicest, most charming parts of the place is the fact that here the trains come by quite a bit. Framing studio in there. This is dead space. A lot of the spaces around here are just rented for storage, so that's good. I mean, it's quiet. They don't make any mess, no dust. This is doors I found in the antiques shop in New Jersey. I don't know exactly where they came from. It came complete with a latch. All I had to do was provide a latch. And this is my studio space. Close the doors to keep out the noise. Turn the lights on. And the music off. It's a project I've been working on for about 2 years. And what it involves is taking old 8mm and 16mm home movies and 8mm and 16mm pornographic movies. I started with those actually because they were easier to find. And looking through them one frame at a time. And when you look through some of these one frame at a time, and there are tens of thousands of frames on any given reel, and I'm looking for a certain movement, a certain choreography, a certain motion that takes place that you wouldn't recognize, you wouldn't even see it if you were there when it was happening, or even if you looked at this movie on a movie projector. These things are 16 frames per second, and some of the pictures I've done, some of the finished pieces, they represent a third of a second. They represent a half of a second. And they go by so quickly that if you were watching the movie, you wouldn't even see it. And so I'm looking at it one frame at a time, and it gives you a totally different perspective on a lot of what's happening. The actual process of converting this tiny, tiny, tiny little positive transparency into a 16 by 20 inch print, it's not all that difficult. It's not technically, there's no rocket science involved in it. It can be very tedious, particularly dealing with issues of focus and exposure, but it's not difficult. The difficult part is finding continuous frames that when you put them together, create the 16 by 20 prints, and you put them on the wall that present an interesting image, something that engages the viewer, something that it's interesting to look at. And regardless of, I can talk a lot about, how looking at the world one frame at a time gives you a totally different perspective, and how a lot of things happen in these movies that are unexpected. The person taking the movie didn't expect, for example, someone to walk through the frame, and it just presents this magical 1.5 seconds that no one expected. But all of that aside, when you create the finished piece, you put it up on the wall, unless it's actually interesting, unless it engages the viewer, unless it makes you either think a little bit differently about how you look at things, or you just enjoy looking at it, that it's sort of all meaningless. This piece is one I'm really happy with, because during the last 2 years I've created about 10 finished pieces that I'm really pleased with. I've created about 10 other pieces that I've destroyed because I'm not pleased with them. I'm not incredibly prolific, and I'm very objective about my own work. So if it isn't good, it gets destroyed, because there's enough bad art in the world. But the pieces I like, I know instantly when I put them on the wall that I like them. This piece, it's only 5 frames. Again, it's like a third of a second, and it took place in a pornographic movie from probably the 1970s. And when I printed it, when I saw the contiguous frames, I liked them. I liked them a lot. Did a contact print, I wasn't too sure about it. And then I printed them, and I really didn't like them. I had them on a table and I viewed them, and I put them on the floor and I viewed them. And I put them on the wall, and wow, they worked. So these things you really have to, that's part of this whole studio, is that it's an opportunity to get things on the wall and to look at them and to see them how they're supposed to be viewed and make judgments then about them. Another good thing about a studio space is that, you can experiment. And this is actually a finished piece, but it wasn't finished until very recently. I had to burnish the thumbtack holes out of the corners. People always make fun of me because I thumbtack my work to the wall. But sometimes when you're experimenting, moving, tearing, and cutting up things, you have to just stick them up any way they go, and you have to be able to move them. That's my point. And working on this on the floor, it just didn't work. I had to work on it on the wall, and I had to get it on the wall, get it finished on the wall to see what it was really going to look like. So even the process of creating collage has to take place at a viewer's perspective, or from a viewer's perspective. Some of my larger pieces, actually this is going along this wall is my sketch pad. Photographers also need a sketch pad. It isn't just painters and people who draw who need sketch pads. I do a lot of work with, I've done a lot of work in the last year or two with different types of, trying to create very organic collages from some of these negatives, some of this picture. Trying different types of formatting to get across the same concept of motion and the choreography that takes place in the picture. This piece is actually, it's in my sketch pad because it was a piece that didn't work. It was one of the contiguous pieces that I created. It was like about, I don't know, it was big. It was about 24 frames long. It was about 40 foot long. This woman walks onto the pier and talks to this gentleman who's working on the boat. This is Barbados, by the way, 1930. The piece just lacked, it lacked what I'm trying to accomplish. It lacked movement, it lacked choreography, it lacked, there wasn't enough motion in the whole piece to justify it, particularly as big as it was. But single frame is fun. I mean, it's I kept a frame because I like it. I just like I guess I would like to have been in Barbados in 1930. I don't know. This is the next piece I'm doing, actually. I've already printed the negatives. I'm not sure that I'm going to do the sequence of negatives I've already printed, but I am going to do a sequence of this woman sitting on a park bench feeding pigeons. The actual movie was taken in New York in 1929, which was, 1939, which was the last year of the Depression. And I think her sitting there feeding those pigeons just screams depression.